I'm going to go ahead and start recording this webcast. We will post the recording as well as the slides from today's webcast to the CA security community, which is ca.com/talksecurity if you've not already become a member. And today's webcast is about the new release of CA Single Sign-On 12.52, sp1, cr5 enhancements. And today's presenters are Aaron Berman, Senior Advisor, and Steve McCligan, who's a Senior Principal Support Engineer here on the CA Security Support Team. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for presenting today. We will open up the lines for live Q&A at the end of this presentation. So if you have any questions, feel free to hold them until the end, and we can get to those either over the phone lines or in the chat window or Q&A window. But if you do have a burning question, feel free to ask it in the chat window or Q&A window during the presentation. So I'm going to pass it over to Aaron now. Thanks so much again, Aaron, for doing this today. I love community webcasts.
Thanks, Kristen, and hello, everyone. I'm glad you could make it here. So today we're going to talk about a recent release that we just had, CA Single Sign-On or SiteMinder 12.52 Service Pack 1 cr5. CR5 was released, I believe, a week and a half ago now, and of course, it contains bug fixes like everything else does, but also contains some new enhancements. And that's the big thing to keep in mind is we do, from time to time, put some new enhancements into our CRs. So you do have to keep aware of what's going on with them and understand. Generally, they're smaller little features, but what I find is that they're features that tend to be very helpful for administrators and things like that. So, for example, in CR4, the last CR, there was three big features that we added that I think many of our customers actually really enjoyed. It was and when you have a IIS web agent, you, in CR4, introduced the ability to have multiple agent configuration objects for each individual website on a single IIS server. So now you can have an IIS server with, 10 different websites on it, and each website can have a different agent configuration object. Or you can mix and match, and you can have one agent configuration object for 5 of them, and then the other 5 can have individuals. We also added the ability in CR4 to turn off authorization calls, so that normally a web agent makes a is protected call, is authenticated call, and then is authorized call to the policy server. If you have an application where you want to let everybody in, or the application is doing its own authorization, you can turn off those authorization calls now with an agent configuration object switch. And that will tell the agent not to bother to make those additional calls. It significantly reduces the chattiness of SiteMinder, and also reduces the latency we add to transactions. A nice feature for many of my customers out there. And lastly, we introduced the ability to do integrated Windows authentication login when you're doing single sign-on with Office 365 using the thick clients like Excel and Word and Link and so on, Outlook. So now we can do Windows authentication using those thick clients as well as just doing browser-based Windows authentication or password authentication to Office 365. So in CR5, what we did is the new enhancements really focused around our session store and some performance metrics and visibility into the environment around some slower transactions. And that's really what we introduced in CR5 here. Now, before we get into that, there's a quick refresher. Many of you I know are familiar with and are using session stores, but session store is really an optional component in a SiteMinder architecture, depending on what functions you wish to do. Very often we hear people say that, or learn that when they log in to SiteMinder, SiteMinder doesn't actually, out of the box, without a session store, remember that you're actually actively logged in, and remember you have an active session. So when you log out, if you were to send your cookie back from your browser back in after you hit the logout button, SiteMinder will continue to honor that cookie, because logout really just deletes it from the browser, or tries to. So now we can actually, with the session store, we can mark and remember that a session is in fact logged out. And very often that shows up in securability reports and audit reviews when people get their security teams involved and things like that. The session assurance feature requires the session store. The session assurance feature that was introduced in SiteMinder 12.52 is takes a fingerprint of the browser and of the device and stores that in the session store, and then we periodically will recheck that fingerprint to make sure it matches. And what we're looking at there is we're trying to look at making sure that a session is not inadvertently taken or stolen and then used by a different device or a different attacker. Also, session store is used around federation. When you're doing single logout for federation, we require the session store because we have to remember where you federated to. Also, if you're doing inbound federation, and there's additional data in the assertion that comes to us that we want to keep and use, we can store that data in the session store and then pull that data out using a standard SiteMinder response and pass that back to an application, just as if the data was in your directory or database. And that actually facilitates in many of my customers, especially in the B2C world, in the consumer side, that are accepting federated transactions, that in many cases they don't actually even ever have a copy of the user's account in an LDAP directory. They take the claim, they read the claim, and then they just put the data in the session store, and it lives for the life of that session. Also, global delivery has a module which ties in with the session store as well, and I'm seeing this requirement pop up more and more in the ability to administratively log a user out. So Aaron logs in to SiteMinder, and for one reason or another, we want to administratively log Aaron out, even while he's actively clicking around the website. This global delivery module allows you to do that. Possibly, there was some fraud detected on the account or something like that. I've got one large bank looking at doing something very similar in that regard. Mostly, if their fraud system goes off, they want the user to be disabled immediately, and if they have an active session, be automatically logged out. So that's with a global delivery module, that functionality, but it's another use case where we're using the session store. In short, we're seeing this more and more of our customers use session stores for various things. Actually, another thing that's not even on the list is to use cookie providers securely. Cookie providers by default put stuff on the query string. To actually do it securely, we can actually take the session, put it in the session store. There's an ACO setting called Store Session in Server to allow you to deploy cookie providers in a secure manner. The session store today, we support Oracle databases, Microsoft SQL databases, and also CA Directory as a session store. So really, you have those three different platform choices to choose from. We provide a license of CA Directory for you to use as a session store for Node as part of your standard SiteMinder or SSO license. When a user logs in, we create objects in the session store about the identity, about the session, and the session information. And depending on whether or not you have a persistent realm or a non-persistent realm, but if you have a persistent realm, we will recheck that every time the user accesses a page. For large sites, there's a lot of writes, that's a lot of reads, and that can cause delays in the infrastructure just because SiteMinder is doing more work. But also it can cause delays because there's a lot of work at the directory or database level too, and replication, a lot of writes, and a lot of reads, and so on. This is where, we saw several customers of ours have cases where under high peak load conditions, they saw large numbers of writes going to the directory, large numbers of sessions getting created, and then that data not being deleted properly or just too much load being applied. and too much of a slowdown overall to SiteMinder for these session stores. So that's the nature of some of these enhancements. The whole goal is to make the session store easier to use and SiteMinder run better and be much more configurable. So to reduce round trips between the session store and the policy server, rather than going on every single request and trying to go back and check and validate that the session is still valid in the session store, we added the ability to tell for the policy server to remember that a session is valid. It's almost like another cache that is, if you want to think about it as a session store validity cache. And the default setting of that cache is 1 second. Timeouts are affected when you actually set that setting, because if a user's timed out, in theory, they could extend their timeout by whatever the cache is, because the session would still be considered valid in memory. But it's a great way to avoid having to query the same session store over and over and over again repeatedly when a user launches a page, for example, that has, and the page might have 10 objects in it. Each requires a separate authorization, which in turn would each require a separate call to the session store. Now you can remember that, and you can control how big, what the duration is for that cache. And this was designed to reduce the number of reads to the session store, and by doing that, it is going to be a little bit less work on the policy server, less work on the communication handles as well, and really it allows you to manage that expectation of performance a little bit better. It's similar to the validation period setting, but the validation period setting is on the agent side of the cache, not the server side, if you want to think of it that way. And so if we don't check every time to see if the session is valid, it could, in theory, extend the length of time of the idle timeout. So if you set that for, 30 seconds, if the session is done and timed out, if it's in the cache, it still might be, we still might do an authorization for like an additional 30 seconds. And you can sort of see the location of that setting there. You do have to add it manually to the registry, either the registry itself or the sm.registry file if you're running on a Linux system. Likewise, when you start adding all these sessions into the environment, the question is how do they get deleted? And so we changed how we're doing deletions. It used to be we would make a query to the session store, pull back the list of all the expired sessions, and then begin deleting them. Obviously, if you have a large number of expired sessions, that's a query that can take a long time to run. So now, with this maintenance query row limit setting, what we do is we identify how many records to bring back before we start deleting. So the default is we pull back 100 records, which is going to be a much faster query than if you have 100,000 expired accounts or expired sessions. And the whole goal is to not spend so much time on having the threads wait on individual transactions, not spending a lot of extra time on the directory side or the database side, and being able to, effectively just pull back smaller bunches. It's paging is what it is. Again, you see the registry setting for that. The default is 100. But you can set that higher, set that lower, depending on your individual thresholds. For a high-performing system, high volume, that you might want to look at maybe bumping that default up even by a little bit. But everybody's experience in the field differs. When you're using the CA directory as a session store, and this is something specific when you're using CA directory, we have the existing directory threads around for create, searching, and updating. What we didn't want to do is we didn't want to slam those threads too badly. What we found is that many of those threads were spending so much time doing creates and mods and deletes with the session store, they couldn't handle other traffic. So now with deletes, you can identify the maximum number of concurrent deletes that we will send to the directory at any one time. So over the connections. So now max concurrent deletes will tell the policy server, do not try to delete more than 25. Wait until one of the 25 comes back before you send the 26th delete command. That way, we're not trying to queue up so much over the connection. And also, since when you look at this, how the session store's data is managed in the directory, each session store entry is almost like a little tree all by itself, where it has a main session and then can have child objects. So now we delete all of those at the same time, and that helps to reduce the the problem where you may have dangling child objects dangling behind the scenes. So you can see the max concurrent deletes ACO setting as well. The default here is 25. Again, I think that's probably a reasonable default for most of our customer deployments.
Yeah, this is Steve. Just to add to that, it's a delete tree now. Previously, what made it slow is each child was individually deleted one at a time. So if you did persistent sessions for Windows context, that would be 3 variables under one session. So that's actually 4 deletes. Now it's just a delete tree.
Okay, super. Thanks, Steve. So hopefully that gives a lot more performance about how we're accessing the session store, gives you a lot more controls around the deletes, fewer queuing back and forth, waiting for large numbers of sessions to come back. And we've found, everyone's mileage will differ depending on your specific environment and the characteristics of how often you read from it, how often you write from it, how fast the directory or database can read and write and replicate and all that. But we have seen some very significant performance enhancement increases in our labs. So, other than that, there's a big way, when you think about monitoring your transactions, we have some new enhancements as well. Now, monitoring is one of those things that means a whole bunch of things to a whole bunch of different people. And we've actually done a communities webcast on monitoring SiteMinder or SSO by a whole separate one all by itself. But very specifically, one of the things we know that kills SiteMinder when, I would probably say 90 to 95% of the calls we get in support that says my entire SiteMinder environment is down. It come from a case where SiteMinder is having slow transactions for one reason or another. And what ends up happening is that everything queues up and builds up, and that's why the whole environment goes down. So the idea is what if we could just get a list of transactions that took longer than a certain period of time? I also like to think of it as the service level agreement log, because most of the time when I see in large access control environments, the SSO team comes to me and they say, you know what, we have a service level agreement that the overhead we provide to the login transaction cannot be more than 200 milliseconds, and hypothetically, or more than 300 milliseconds. And when that happens, it violates our SLAs with our customers, meaning the application owners. And this is a log that's specifically designed to be able to pull that data out. Previously, the only way to do this was to enable the trace log with precise timing, and then run the trace log through the tool that we have on the community site to do the log parsing of the trace log itself. Now, we can actually dump any transaction that occurs into the SiteMinder policy server log. So you can actually have a list of transactions that were too slow automatically already in that log without ever turning tracing on. the default setting for this threshold is 5,000 milliseconds, or 5 seconds. That actually, to me, is a very conservative default setting. But you know, if a transaction of an authentication or an authorization is taking 5 seconds, then your system's probably already is already down, to be quite honest with you. But you know, you can change that to whatever you want in milliseconds. You see the registry key, and you know, it might start. You might want to start at 1,000. You might want to start it at 1,500. You might want to start it at 500, depending on your environment. And you can continually turn it down as you go and as you understand it, because there's no use turning it to such a low value that you just get slammed right out of the gate. Like I said earlier, I think it's a great way to be able to see all the list of all the transactions that don't meet the defined service level agreements, or be able to dive in a little bit deeper. Real world scenario. I had a customer that has more than 5,000 applications behind SiteMinder. They went through a whole new rollout and really developed a top-notch architecture and for the environment, and really looked at performance data very carefully. What they saw is something like 80% of their transactions took an average of 20 milliseconds or less in their SiteMinder environment. However, there were certain applications that took 300 milliseconds to do an authorization on. And because they were able to dive in, they were then able to look at what the policies were and then determine that maybe the policies were not written efficiently or written well, or they were providing way too many responses back to the applications, and they can do some tuning. You know, this is another way to be able to capture that sort of level in the environment. So this is what's actually logged. This is an actual sample log entry that's from the SMPS log. You can see there's a date timestamp in there. You can actually see that, you know, there's a lot of keywords you can key off of even if you're using a tool to parse it. Execution time limit threshold exceeded. You can see what the actual transaction time is. In this case, it took 7,500 milliseconds. That's the 7,500. And you see what the threshold was, 5,000. So you can actually see that data very clearly. You see the agent, you see the realm, the user, if there is one, are you user defined, and so on. So you can actually even find who the users were that were affected by the policies or the transactions that took longer than a certain amount of time. All great data to have at your fingertips. And hopefully that log entry is pretty clear and readable. In addition to that, we made some changes to the stats command. That command has been around a very long time, but traditionally it's had a couple of problems in that the stats accumulate from the time the policy server is restarted, and there was no way to ever to reset them. So if you wanted to see the, I don't know, the queue depth, you would see the max queue depth from the time the server was started, not from the last 30 minutes. And also one of the entries in there was called messages. And that messages command really wasn't very clear on what that was. That was not the number of transactions the policy server was processing. It was actually tied to the number of agent pull requests, which may or may not be actually related to the actual number of transactions the policy server is processing. Now you can reset the stats back to 0 using the smpolicyserv-reset stats command. And that will send all those stats back to 0. So then when you run the stats command, you will see the stats just for that period of time since the last time you ran the reset stats or the server was restarted. And this will allow you to get some greater visibility. We've also cleaned up the output from the stats command a little bit as well. Now, there's still some legacy stuff in there, but we've cleaned it up. So this is what the output actually looks like now. And I've sort of highlighted the key elements here in blue. But now messages is the number of transactions the policy server has the number, well, actually, is the number of requests, the number of transactions, and not the number of poll attempts. So I know since the last time this particular policy server had the reset stats command, it processed 58,844 transactions. And you see the throughput of transactions per second. Now, keeping in mind, throughput will go up and down depending on the number of requests going in, right? If you run the throughput, if you're a 9 to 5 shop and you run this, the reset stats, and then 5 minutes later you run the stats command, at midnight, your throughput will be very different than during the middle of the day. We also provide the average response time. In this case, the server was responding at 4.820 milliseconds. So you can actually see overall, things are actually look pretty speedy in the environment. But if you would start getting a report of a slowdown, this is a great way to run reset stats, then a minute later run stats, and you can actually see the average response time over that last minute. So you can get a very quick idea about what your response time is on the server. How long things waited in the queue. When an agent request comes in, it's put into a queue before one of the worker threads picks it up and runs with it and processes it. You can actually see the average time it took for the wait in the queue as well. And we sort of have two different queues. We have the high priority queue, which is really more or less new agent requests. And then we have the normal priority queue, which is just agents doing their standard validation, is authenticated, is authorized type calls. And you can see the high water mark in the queue for new agent requests. And you can also see the current depth for high, and you can also see the current depth for normal as well. Keep in mind that there are still some legacy things in here. Max depth should almost always be will be the maximum depth of either the high priority or the normal priority queue. It's more of a legacy setting in there. You can see current threads, and you can see max threads. Max threads is actually the setting that you have in your SiteMinder console command for the maximum number of threads the policy server is running. The way the policy server is coded now, most of the time after you start up and start processing transactions, current threads grows, will hit max threads, and just stays there. Threads don't close themselves down anymore. So current threads will almost always equal max threads, but we now have a setting called busy threads. And this is the number of threads that are actually running as we speak. So again, you can actually see, okay, I've got max of 8 threads, 0 of them are busy, and the queue is 0. This policy server is either handling all of its transactions very quickly, or it's not, or it may not even be getting transactions in the environment. So again, a nice way using the reset stats command to be able to view data. Hopefully that makes sense. Steve, before I go on, actually, did you have any other comments or any other thing you wanted to add?
No, that's a good summary. I mean, these kind of changes we have in here are, what we've got we see from customers. I mean, we know the profiler, when you turn it on, is going to really affect performance. So that's why we provided these numbers. And the one I like to focus on now is the wait in the queue. So as we said before, a worker thread picks it up, can be used to kind of adjust your threads. Right now, 16 milliseconds is great. I've got some node tests we've done with customers where you can see in the queue, you get up to a second. That's when your threads are either too busy doing something outside searching, or there's something else going on that we need to look at, maybe adjusting the threads if they're too low, increasing them. But you'd like to understand if we have long transactions, if that's what's causing it, and being in the SMPS log, that will help you as well.
Super. Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions here in a minute, but before we do, I just want to take the 2 minutes to remind everyone around our SAS validation program that we have out there, where CA is actually going out partnering with a whole bunch of various third parties and working on managing and developing essentially documentation on exactly how to federate with the various third parties. Ever since federation was added to the core license of SiteMinder, we're seeing a huge uptick in the number of people that are using SiteMinder for federation, and in many cases trying to actually, consolidate, having two different SSO solutions, one for federation, one for access management, just behind SiteMinder. Have a wide variety of these third-party runbooks where actually we identify, exactly what to do on our side, what to do on their side, and exactly how to federate to them. So if you haven't actually been using them, please feel free. I like to think of almost every one of them as like a little mini federation reference architecture on exactly how to configure federation with them. So with that, Kristen, I think we can open it up, and if there are questions, I know we've had a couple of questions come in through the chat as well, and we can open it up to everyone.
So
yeah, great.
I see that one of the questions was about can we shut the execution threshold off? I don't believe at this point, no, it's on. You can obviously set the time higher to lessen the load, but there was a lot of testing we've done specifically because of what we put in CR5 around the session store, and we did have some numbers. I don't know if you have those numbers on this presentation, but the difference in performance was considerable with the previous release, even with the changes that we've done. So there was no shutting this off. So that would answer the restart disable policy server part of that question. It'd be something to think about if you want to put that into an ideation to make additional changes. We thought we captured most of this, but you could put that in for to be able to disable it, or maybe make it XPS configurable to turn on and off. Hope that answers, Herb. Anyone else? Questions?
There was a question about, can we get a copy of the presentation? I know we're putting the recording online.
Yeah, I'll put the slides and the recording in the community, and I'll also send up a follow-up email to all who attended today with links to both of those documents within the community.
Yeah, exactly. And also, this is stuff that is all documented, in the release notes for CR5 as well. Maybe not this level, but it is all documented in the release notes as well.
Oh, question. I was looking in the chat. This gets to some questions in Q&A too.
Oh. Oh, Joe. Okay. There's
let's see.
Nope.
Okay, so Ravi. Okay, SP2 is released. Compared. So right now, SP2 will be coming out with a CR. I think that's the next release. It does. The SP2 does not have what we put in CR5 for Session Store and the SMPS log. I believe, and I'll validate this for you with sustaining. If I believe the changes are going to be put into the next CR of SP2.
Okay. We had someone ask more when I was talking about claims, asking if that's the SOA product line. No, it's not. Now, the idea is that, and I'll explain a little bit in more detail, is the federation really is just all about, two entities that have agreed to trust each other, and one knows who the user is, and it's passing, information about who the user is to the second. In many cases, what we've actually done, and I think that this is probably in violation of the way people originally envisioned these federated standards to work. What we've done is we then, in most cases, we read who the user is, and the first thing we try to do is we try to map it back to a LDAP account or a database account inside our own internal network. That, in my opinion, is probably not the way that people originally thought people were going to implement some of these federated standards, whether it be SAML or OAuth or whatever. Instead, I believe the vision of it was you would put inside the assertion the information about who the user is, and then the service provider would be able to read that data and then process whatever transaction it wants. You wouldn't necessarily have to have a copy of the user's identity at the service provider. Now, what I was talking about claims, really what I was referring to is an architecture where in some cases you don't need a copy of the users in the user store anymore. In some cases you have to or applications might store that information. But from an SSO point of view, I know that I received an assertion from Facebook that this is Aaron Berman. Here's the email address, here's some other information about Aaron. And you know what? That's what I need to know. You know, I have all my key indexes. I know who the user is. I don't need to go turn and look that user up in some other and create an entry for Aaron in my own LDAP directory because I already know who the user is. So rather than copying accounts, which creates identity management problems and deprovisioning problems and, you know, all that other challenge, what if I just use that data in a transient form until the life of that session is over? And the next time the user federates back in, I'll get another copy of the data. And that's what I was referring to in a claims type of an architecture. It's using session store to store that transient data that comes over in the assertion and not always have to copy and create a new account for the user and then map that user to that specific account. It's a great use of session store, like I said earlier, especially in a B2C type of an environment, where you know, I've got a couple of places that are doing like online commerce stores and things like that, where if you federate from Facebook in, great, wonderful, we know who you are, we know your email address, so when we send you a confirmation email, we can send you a confirmation email that you bought something. I don't need to remember that. It's just, you know, was there for the lifetime of the session. Sort of thing. And because what we're finding more and more is the provisioning aspects of federation is actually the harder stuff rather than just the single sign-on aspect of federation.
Okay. Another question was, what is the difference between the ACO parameters session grace period and session update period? From the new one that's out there that's been set up for the policy server? Well, those two settings are related to the agent. The session grace period is how often the agent will update its session and send it back down to the client's browser. In the session update period relates to the cookie provider on its updating of the master cookie. The new setting is more very similar to in the realm of the validation checking. So when you mark a session as session and you check that in the realm, it tells the session's marked as persistent and will now have to go to the session store to validate whatever you put in there for a time. And there were some drawbacks to that, and that's why we added this to the server side, because that's for the realm, doesn't work with the SDK and agents. So we put it on the server side, and as the presentation says, it's more for caching as well, and more for speed. And yeah. All right, what else we got?
Yeah, we have one about policy serve stats command. The comment was we should see significantly less messages recorded since it only includes actual transaction counts. Correct.
Right.
My answer would probably be it depends. It probably depends on your architecture. If in most cases, probably yes. But I know of some customers that might have, 1,000 web agents, but each web agent only does 2 transactions an hour, and that's probably an overstatement and a oversimplification, but you get the idea. And then, but the web agent might poll every 30 seconds, And then I know some customers that web agent might pull every 30 seconds, but that web agent is doing thousands of transactions per hour. So, you know, if you're doing, it probably is a little bit environmental dependent. But yeah, in general, most of the web agents we see out there do more than one transaction every 30 seconds. And 30 seconds is the default polling interval. So yeah, in most cases, in most cases, actually, you probably would see more messages than polls. Steve, unless you disagree with that.
No, that's good.
And then we have a recommendation to add Linux setup commands. I imagine that's referring to the actual the registry stuff. What I would probably say is it's my long-term goal to try to take as much out of that registry and make it, you know, being able to even manage through the UI at some point in the future. You know, we're trying to simplify the product as we go, but that's a long-term type of thing. Certainly looking for any recommendations like that. Feel free to create an idea as well in the idea section of the community. We do read them and do respond to them.
Yeah, I mean, we've been tossing around the idea of an XML based instead of getting away from the registry as well and making it more central. So the ideation's the way to go with that, and vote on it and see if we can't make that change.
Yep.
Policy over memory. Policy over memory needs to be increased. No, there's no. We haven't seen significant memory usage with all of the load testing we have done with this. So there shouldn't be a need for this. It looks pretty good.
Yeah. Someone pointed out I had a typo. I said S policy serve, not SM policy serve, reset stats. I apologize for that.
I must have missed that one too.
There's a comment here, CA fixed the duplicated session ID error caused by timeout. Is that fix included in this release? Steve, I'm not familiar with that fix. Are you?
No, I have to look at that up for Steve, so I can take that off and take a look. I'm not duplicate session ID error. Huh? All right, that's okay. We can get back with it.
Okay. And then we have the one I think we already talked about. Is CA planning to replicate all these in the sp2 release?
Yeah.
And you know, I believe the answer there is yes. That should follow in. I'm not exactly sure how much of this is going to fit into the sp2 CR. Right now, is our plan is that, you know, the sp2 and sp1 are going to sort of merge themselves back up together when we release SiteMinder or SSO 12.6. And the plan is for that towards the end of this year to try to avoid those problems in the future.
Okay.
All right, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A window or the chat window, but if anyone wants to ask a question over the phone line, you can unmute your line by pressing #6 or *6, or if you're listening to the broadcast, the audio broadcast, you can click the telephone icon with the question mark in it, and I can unmute your line as well there. Prakar, did you have any additional questions? There's another question. Is there a way to totally turn off, hold on, it just disappeared. Is there a way to totally turn off or at least reduce the size of the SMMON component registered XML? You can see that code.
Right. That's not part of these changes here. That specific data is for our monitor data going from the agent to the parser. So we didn't make any changes in that area. Again, that could be something you might want to put to the idea site. on the, I mean, to turn it off on the agent side, I believe if you go down and turn enabling monitoring off, or I think that's the issue parameter, the agent doesn't send the SM-on data.
Yeah, that might be the way to do it. I mean, if you want that to go away. However, you know, I would argue that collecting the monitoring data is actually can be very useful because you have if you're using either the one view or having it tied to Wiley or a third-party system that's collecting that data.
Right.
Okay. Well, if we don't have anything else, I want to thank everyone for their time, and hopefully we continue to do some of these. You know, like I said, between CR4 and CR5, hopefully there's a lot of new little features that makes our administrators' lives a little easier, and that's the goal.
Yeah, I think there's one more question.
Oh.
Is that you just don't want to see it in the log? I think if you're referring to the NDSM profile log, I mean, we could just provide you what the component and the data point is for that, and you just don't include that. I believe that might be one of the authorization components, but it's part of you know, part of the profiling. So the profiling you could do is you can go in the profiling all the way up to the point of you can go into I think it's the third tab and say what not to, if it contains this type of filter, don't print it. You know what I mean? If you do SMM mod, you know, not this. Not a lot of customers use that, probably even know about that, but profiling can limit what you put in there and even be more specific to verbiage in the file.
Okay. Kristen, all yours.
All right, thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you Aaron and Stephen for presenting. Like I said, we'll post the slides and the recording to the CA security community, which you can find by going to ca.com/talksecurity. And I'll also send up an email with links to both of those documents in the security community if you're not already a member, so you know exactly where to go to find them. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great week, and we'll see you again on the next community webcast.